to start that now, because we don't trust my old laptop to be able to hold it. Shout out HISA, heck yeah. For those who haven't yet discovered it, the chat option is very much in use today, and we hope folks will continue to use it, both during the presentation to gather your thoughts, share some questions, and certainly after the 30 minutes or so of Sage's talk, we will come back together into this room and have a conversation. Ask some questions of the literature, of the research, of one another as we think about the ways that advocacy shows up on college campuses for survivors of sexual violence. We've talked about how to find closed captioning, so I've got that part down. And again, we'll ask folks to stay muted during the presentation, and then when we get into the conversation part at the end, if you have a question or a thought you'd like to share, we'll ask you to unmute and also turn on your camera if you can, so that we know who has something they'd like to share. And again, using the chat option is also available during that time. So without further ado, I would like to introduce today's presenter, Saege Robinson, who has been absolutely instrumental in making the DRCC what it is this year. Despite the fact that it's gone virtual, I don't think that we could have planned the conference the way we did without her wisdom and insight, and I have been very lucky to have shared space with her throughout the semester in planning DRCC, and look forward to continuing that relationship beyond this semester. So Saege, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was so nice. I'm so happy to be here today with you all and to be kicking off our virtual series for the DRCC this year. So thank you for bearing with us through all the technological challenges that this can sometimes bring. So I'm about to share my presentation with you for my screen, and we can get started. So my presentation today is going to be talking about peer advocacy for sexual violence survivors on college campuses, and is it an alternative approach to prevention? There's a question mark at the end of there because I want to pose that as a question to you all, and to kind of focus our conversation on that towards the end of our session together today. So Sarah did a lovely introduction for me, but just wanted to introduce myself to all of you. Some of you I know, some of you I have not yet met, but I'm Saege Robinson. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a first-year graduate student with the Higher Education and Student Affairs Administration program here at UVM. My assistantship is with the Department of Residential Life as an assistant residence director over in leadership and social change in Harris Millis. And like Sarah said, this semester in my practicum, I interned with the Women's Center as the co-chair for the 2020 Dismantling Rape Culture Conference, which this is the 15th year. So very happy to be a part of sharing this with you all today and working on this project all semester with Sarah and our wonderful committee, and just the UVM and Burlington community as a whole has been really great and super supportive. And something that's going to be prevalent to today's conversation is a little bit about my positionality in my work that I did in undergrad at the University of New Hampshire. I'm going to be talking a little bit about my experiences there and my work with sexual violence prevention and education work. So the purpose of this presentation today is to engage remotely in DRCC material. I know that I was really bummed that we couldn't come together in community last Thursday, but super excited to be able to share some of my knowledge and just have a conversation even remotely. And to talk about campus advocacy programs and utilizing peer advocates as a model and the challenges that can come with that, and also the potential benefits as well, and brainstorming ideas of how we can engage in best practices for prevention, intervention, and education training for our students in this field of work. And just the goal overall for me is to connect with one another and converse on how the UVM community can take action to improve sexual violence response and prevention. Just some things I want to name before we get started is that I am by no means an expert in this work. I'm just sharing with you my experiences in this work and my experiences as someone who identifies as a survivor, and the things that I want to talk about and the things that I think will be could be potentially of really great benefit to this line of work. And just everyone's healing journey is different and very unique, and I want to name that and acknowledge that things that work for me and things that I've benefited from have not and will not always benefit others. And so that's why it's really important to all come together and have these conversations and contribute. I also want to name that marginalized student populations are impacted by these issues in greater capacities, but the image of that we typically see of survivors is that white cis female, and a lot of the research focuses on that, but that is not always going to be beneficial, or it takes away from the voice of those who are most silenced in these issues. 80% of sexual violence occurrences that happen on college campuses are reported or disclosed by white women, but women of color, and especially trans women of color, are are the populations that are most impacted, as well as Native students and peoples. So that's just something that I want to name, because I think it really informs how we approach this work, and making sure that we're thinking of all of the identities and how intersectionality plays into it, and how everyone's going to show up differently in these spaces, and what might be beneficial to one survivor may not be beneficial to another. And so just really centering them in their stories and giving them space to heal and process in their own time and what feels best to them. So going into it, this is just a quote by Tanara Burke that I wanted to share, that I think kind of informs where I'm going with this presentation, and something that really resonates with me. So people are trying to find an outlet to tell their truth. And I think that's really telling of sexual violence prevention and response work, and what outlets, just kind of questioning what outlets do we have, what outlets are available, and what's being beneficial to our students and what's being harmful to our students, and how do we open up spaces in order to allow outlets for truth telling and storytelling, and not just sharing one single image or one story, but really opening it up to reach those who are impacted by this, and how can we improve prevention and response. So I'm going to talk about how peer advocacy can potentially serve as an method or a model to kind of open up that conversation, to be able to allow folks to access resources and resources for healing, or things that they might need to find community. Peer advocacy can take on a lot of different meanings or definitions, including like, is a peer advocate someone who identifies as a survivor? Is it just a peer at their, and when it's talking about specifically institutional, like higher education, is it just a peer in that they're another student, or is it someone who is a part of that university? What does it mean? It can take on a lot of different things. My experience with peer advocacy work was, it started at the University of New Hampshire, where they've been really instrumental in researching different types of peer advocacy and bystander intervention work for college campuses. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about peer advocacy later, but just wanting to kind of give some background first. So in my experience at the University of New Hampshire, I came across two things that I think are really instrumental in wanting to share when it comes to sexual violence prevention on college campuses. And the first is bringing in the bystander, which is a bystander intervention program that's pretty widely used across the globe now. And part of the reason is because it's been so heavily researched, which a lot of these types of programs are not. And so there aren't as many of them, including peer advocacy programs. And the other thing that the University of New Hampshire had that I volunteered with was the sexual harassment and rape prevention program, which is an entire office on campus dedicated to this work. And everyone calls it, just the acronym is SHARP. So bringing in the bystander and SHARP are the two things that I was first exposed to as a student at the University of New Hampshire. So Bring in the Bystander is a community-based approach to sexual violence. It's a lot like step-up bystander intervention and has informed a lot of the other bystander intervention trainings that a lot of universities implement across campuses. And the approach assumes that everyone plays a role in ending violence against or ending sexual violence on college campuses. And it's widely researched and implemented as a community-based approach. And people have, in the research that has been done, students shown that no matter where they've kind of gone into that before the training, they mark improvement in knowing and feeling more comfortable in addressing or being an active bystander, as you hear so often, or being more knowledgeable about how rape culture shows up in college campus spaces. This training is now implemented at hundreds of institutions, and two of the researchers that were really instrumental in creating this were Victoria Banyard and Robert Eckstein, who were two of my previous professors that I had at UNH that I worked with as a research assistant, partially not directly on this work, but with work relating to sexual violence prevention models for college campuses, specifically at UNH, as well as some work in local high schools in Durham. So this is kind of how I started into this like line of work and research and just interest in being an advocate and looking into ways that we can improve across institutions. So that was the first. And then the University of New Hampshire's sexual harassment and rape prevention program is the thing that I really want to focus on, is that this is really unique, and I haven't seen this in a lot of other spaces, but UNH has this office that's just dedicated to this prevention work, which is really, really cool. And how they get students involved is super unique and really allows for a breadth of students to come together and kind of spread the knowledge and utilize their resources for students who are interested in being advocates and being volunteers for this space to really take what they learn and continue to ripple it out across campus and across different populations of students. So like I mentioned before, peer advocates as a model for an alternative form of response to sexual violence on college campus and potentially prevention and better education models. So peer advocates are students at the University of New Hampshire. They don't have to have any specific status or identity or anything that in particular. All they have to do is show an interest in becoming a peer advocate. When I've said or mentioned peer advocates to folks in these conversations before, a lot of red flags typically go up about like, oh, what does that training look like? Like, what does that look like if a student peer advocate is holding like a crisis line position and providing coverage for that and having these conversations with other students that could be really triggering if they have their own experiences and identities as a survivor. There's a lot of things that come with this and a lot of questions that people have, and I totally want to name that. And I also think that UNH does a really good job at preparing the peer advocates for this position, this responsibility, this job. They have to complete an entire semester-long course. It's 2 credits. It's called Justice Studies 410, and it's the advocacy training program. It's a semester-long, meets 2 times a week, 2 or 3 times a week, depending on the session and the length of the class. But it's like full course, and they have to commit to a minimum of 1 academic year and be on call for sharp 3 times a semester. So that is a 24/7 support line for any sexual violence, domestic violence, stalking, any of those things. It's really meant to be a really accessible resource to students, and it's very well known across campus as the resource for students to call if they are in need to talk to someone. It's also completely confidential. And I also I don't think I've named this before, but I was not a peer advocate at UNH. I was an RA, and those two things kind of overlapped in a unique way of being a mandated reporter for the Office of Res Life, and then being a peer advocate and being a confidential resource. There were some, I couldn't really hold both hats as a student, so but I volunteered with Sharp in other capacities. And a lot of my friends were peer advocates, and they would tell me about the types of trainings and they did in their classes. And you wouldn't be able to become a peer advocate if you didn't meet the requirements at the end of the semester of being kind of approved for that position. So very intentional training, very intentional. The professors that teach it, very knowledgeable of this line of work, really centering the survivors and the victims of these situations on the other ends of the line, and having those disclosure conversations and being able to give students better access to resources that they need and to seek community and healing. So that's my own definition and experience with peer advocacy work, and kind of what I envision for peer advocacy programs across campuses. The other thing that Sharp did was they had community educators. So this was a little bit less of a commitment, but students who were still interested in doing this work and spreading awareness and education to their peers could become a community educator, going through a 10-hour training process with completing 6 volunteer shifts and committing to at least 2 semesters of working with Sharp. They would go around campus and help facilitate trainings for different clubs, offices, organizations, staff trainings, faculty trainings, all of these different types of things, as well as put on open houses, anti-violence rallies and walks. Sharp hosted Take Back the Night, all of these different things. As well, I'm going to show you this is a list of the different types of programming that Sharp offers that you can request at UNH as a staff, club, anything. There's things like Sharp 101, put the condom on consent, prevention trainings, Wildcats Get Consent. UNH, their mascot is the Wildcats, sorry. Living in rape culture, and they all range from different things. So these are some of the ones that the the community educators help to facilitate with full-time Sharp staff. And this allows for utilizing student volunteers, allows for them to complete more trainings across campus and like each semester, because they have more, they're able to host more opportunities for people to request trainings because they have a greater capacity to implement those trainings rather than it just be 1 or 2 full-time staff members. Depending on how long you're a community educator, you could be approved to host these by yourself. That doesn't happen until you're really approved to kind of take on that responsibility. And they do take this very seriously. It's very, again, a very intentional, trauma-informed, assuming community responsibility, really taking on that bystander intervention model that has been so widely implemented, but taking it a step further and really opening up conversations like we would have had at the DRCC, and how these how identity plays into role. What does this look like, and how can we as a university do better? This little logo on the side here to your right, on the right side of the screen, the "You Can Help" is kind of Sharp's motto, and really bringing together. It's a very student-centric, let's all come together, everyone can help, let's have these conversations, was very much the culture that I experienced in Sharp, and also in my roles as in other offices across campus. They did a really good job at implementing the students into these conversations, and I think that's really important to name, and I think UNH does it really, really well, but also it's hard to know and measure exactly how effective these types of programs are, because you can't really measure, oh, we're doing 20 programs a week, how many students are we reaching, and how are they actually implementing these active bystander practices into when they are, out on the weekends, or they see something, are they saying something? It's really hard to measure whether or not you're making a difference. And that's another thing that has come up in these conversations that I've had with folks in the past is, what if the trainings, what if it's up to a student, the harm that can also be caused, like in holding the space for a training, they may not be equipped or ready to handle some of these conversations, especially in large training spaces. And I totally agree. It's a very sensitive and topic, and really depends on how the students are prepared and what those spaces look like. Other schools that have implemented very similar trainings are Columbia University has a very similar model to the peer advocates and community educators as UNH. Castleton University also has their peer advocates for change, or PACs they call them, and change stands for creating, honoring, advocating, and nurturing gender equity. So really naming how violence intersects with different marginalized identities across campuses, and how we can advocate for and highlight those things. So what do we know? To sum up, not a whole lot about peer advocacy programs and whether or not they're actually beneficial. I can just speak from my experience at UNH and what I've witnessed and seen, but the research really isn't there for, or not a lot of it, for how peer advocacy can lead to, or does it lead to, better access to survivor resources. We do know that having confidential survivor advocates does increase access to resources and can promote healing, but proper trauma-informed training is essential for the people on the ends of those lines and the advocates that are working to in those capacities and in those spaces. And the community-based prevention approach for bystander intervention definitely increases students' knowledge and can play a role. That's why we've seen it so widely implemented across universities in the United States and abroad. And so, sorry, I'm going to go back to this slide before I move on. But knowing that the community-based prevention approach is working, peer advocacy models, depending on how they're implemented, could lead to more of a community-based approach to violence prevention and also response. So these are just some statistics of kind of reinforcing why is it essential for us to have confidential resources and resources that students can maybe trust and feel more comfortable with. I recognize that this is a fairly cis female-centric model or for the research, and there's also not a lot, or the government doesn't really, there's not a lot of research for about surrounding race and LGBTQ stats, student stats for sexual violence. It's erased more than I'm happy to admit. Well, there's a definite need for more research in those capacities, especially from places like RAIN and other government initiatives. But I just wanted to share this because I think it highlights the importance behind why confidential resources that students can trust and feel comfortable with can access can better increase survivor access to resources and healing. And when survivors believe it's a personal matter, or they believe it's not important, or they're blaming themselves, they're way less likely to go to someone like a mandated reporter, who are often asked to contact police, which can be very triggering and traumatic for especially students of color who might have different experiences, and their police are not trained in these trauma-informed ways of knowing how to have these conversations and access support and always center the student's experience and make space for their truth and asking them what they need instead of telling them what they need. So I just wanted to share this to give some insight into that. And that's kind of how we know we need more ways that students can feel comfortable finding communities of healing. And bystander intervention and peer advocacy can possibly open up access for these. Here are just some research studies that have informed my knowledge, and the research that I've done is also my work with these professors at the University of New Hampshire, just to give you some theoretical background and some literature around why this works. And it's mostly centered on bystander intervention and community-based intervention programs, which is how those things. Can people hear me?
You were just muted for a couple of moments.
Someone muted me. I just unmuted, but I just wanted to make sure before I went on.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I don't know if you caught the last bit of what I said, so I'll just repeat, but this research really centers around the community-based models of bystander intervention and peer advocacy, and I just wrote a paper about how those models can lead to opportunities for things like restorative justice on college campuses, because it opens up pathways for opportunities for healing and more community-driven prevention, education, as well as response work, which is what restorative justice is really centered on. And I'm not going to go into that heavily because I'm not by no means an expert, but that was kind of a big theme in this year's DRCC, which is why I wanted to mention it. Yeah. And so this research really can be summed up by three points that I've come across. And the first is confidential resources are essential. So is the types of training, so survivor-centered and trauma-informed, and the breadth of the students reached can be really impactful and important. So how do we do that, and how can we utilize students as resources in agents for this work? So what does this look like at UVM? I've talked a lot about other universities in my undergrad. So UVM's a part of NASPA's Culture of Respect, which is their initiative to ending campus violence. So those resources look like that UVM utilizes are the Know Your Power campaign, which is the poster that you see here. You might have seen them around campus. I know I've seen them here at UNH, at other universities. A lot of the universities are part of NASPA's Culture of Respect and try and centralize some of their programming. There's the Step Up Bystander intervention, as well as we do have advocacy resources, including Campus Victims Advocate. HopeWorks is huge. I know a lot of students utilize that as confidential resources, as well as STEPS. And there are students who are UVM students who are volunteering at these off-campus programs and resources wanting to do this work, but UVM doesn't have a space where students can volunteer in those capacities. And who is allowed to do that and who has the opportunity to maybe go off campus and get those trainings, and who's in charge of what that looks like at UVM, and is that even a possibility? Just posing some of those questions to kind of provoke some thoughts and what that looks like. In order to move into our next section, which is just opening the conversation, and Sarah's going to help facilitate this, but just some thoughts to kind of helping folks engage is, would peer advocacy programs increase survivors' access to resources in or outside of UVM? So what does that look like if we have a UVM program that works to do this work with students instead of students going off campus? As well as how does this impact marginalized student populations? Does it increase access to resources and healing for students who are not the traditional, very vocal white survivor, and what are thoughts and ideas of how this model or system perpetuates and interrupts rape culture in spirit of the DRCC. So just some things to get your thoughts. I'd love to hear what folks have to say, or any questions that folks have too. Sarah, I'm going to hand it back over to you.
Thank you, Saege. Yeah, thank you so much for gathering all of that research and information and sharing it with us. I know folks are throwing some things, I think, into the chat, and we'll ask folks to both, you can put questions there if you'd like, or if folks have kind of responses or thoughts that Saege has brought up in sharing this information and research with us, and in regard to these prompts that you see on their screen, feel free to unmute. I would ask if you are able to also unmute your camera, so to speak, so we can see your face. If you want to share your response or interpretation of next steps or how UVM might respond.
I will say I can't see the chat unless I exit out of the PowerPoint. So should I do that, or should I keep up these questions?
I can see the chat, and everybody is thanking you a lot. Thank you very much for the presentation. Well done talk. Thank you, Saege, for sharing your experiences and research. Great presentation, good work. I'm curious, are folks familiar with the concept of peer advocacy? Is this the first you've heard of it? Does anyone have thoughts or considerations around the ways that peer advocacy could or could not perpetuate or disrupt rape culture as we think about it as a system of response to survivors on campuses? I've been told that I'm supposed to wait even longer in a Teams meeting than I would in an in-person space when I pose a question. But it is somehow that much more awkward online. Again, you can type something into the chat if you have a question or a response or thoughts about what Saege has presented, or you can unmute yourself and jump into the conversation. That's one of my cats. Perfectly timed. She has thoughts. Gypsy.
I can respond. I can kick it off.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Get people motivated. Hold on. Can you see me? Is it working? We're working. Yeah. Cool. Hey, great job, by the way.
Thank you.
Fantastic. So yes, I'm familiar with peer advocacy groups, specific at UVM. But I think that it disrupts the rape cycle because, you know, like sexual violence is a very taboo topic, and not able to talk about it for various reasons, like Saege shared. And so I think when there's opportunity for students to come together on a very peer level, not like a criminal justice system, and they can talk about it openly, I think it helps break the cycle of like, oh, don't talk about it, don't ever like bring it up again, and it can facilitate some like healing that a lot of survivors need.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And I think that's something I've noticed too with peer advocacy work, and it often, the people who volunteered at Sharp often were drawn to that line of work because of their own experiences as maybe going through their healing process as a survivor. And I think part of their journey was they got to a point where they were able to and wanted to play that role of being an advocate and understanding and embracing that very survivor-centered response conversation as an advocate. And I think that helped in some circumstances was really overwhelming at times for students, for sure, and may have there's definitely that potential of causing more harm, but also in embracing in their story and allowing other people to share their truth and be met with validation is really powerful. I think that's what is a lot of people find in those types of affinity as well, but it's not necessarily a requirement to be a peer advocate is to identify as a survivor. But I think for some, bringing their own healing to that level can be really powerful as well.
Yeah, I have a question. Did you ever find that like in some of these peer advocacy groups that people were sharing their story for the first time, and if so, was they encouraged? Were they encouraged like a reporter, or just like to just share their story and that was it? Like, how do you guys go about navigating that? Like, say it happened like recently, and like, would you like, oh, there's a reporter? Like, just like, how did the process go?
Yeah. So so for the kind of the process for the conversations that they would. Sorry, can you repeat the question? I just want to make sure I'm understanding you correctly.
I was asking if someone like reported, like if someone shared in the group for the first time that they got sexually harassed, whether it's like on campus or whatever, like recently. Right. Was they like were you guys encourage them to report it or just to like share their story? Like what was the encouragement you gave someone that was reporting for the first time in the group?
Yeah.
Give it to them.
Thank you. So I didn't ever experience being a peer advocate because I was a mandated reporter. So my role as a with Sharp was very different. And if someone like one of my residents as an RA like disclosed something to me, I would be required to, like by law and through my position, to report it. And I always, before it kind of got to that point, I would always, if I was having a conversation with a student, kind of name that so they knew that it was out of kind of both of our hands. Of the control was taken away from them at that point. Like if they had said something, I would have to pass that along. But so for these, if someone was disclosing, say like they were sexually assaulted, harassed, or whatever they were experiencing for the first time, they can just have that one phone call and be done. It doesn't matter. Like they don't need to. There's no expectation for them to report further. There's no expectation or need for them to do anything post that phone call. So the phone call could act as just like, I just need to tell someone this, and then like I'm gonna work it out on my own, but I just need to like talk to someone about it, and I don't want to talk to my friends because I'm afraid they're gonna judge me, or I'm afraid they won't be understanding. But the kind of the advocate's role and responsibility was just like validating and hearing whatever the student had to say, and also completely confidential. Like it wouldn't be shared with anyone, and there was no expectation of or follow-up. But what they are encouraged to do is to contact resources like the counseling center, health and well-being, kind of laying out their options of, if you want to report this, like Title IX, like we can go there, we can do, like what does this look like for you? And some students really want like to take that route, and other students just want to have that one conversation and know that, okay, I could go to Sharp again, I could call this number again if I need to talk about this more, or if I go make an appointment with the counseling center. Like it was also, it's just kind of hearing what they need and helping to all of that.
You're breaking up. Or is it just me? Going in and out.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Yeah. Sorry. So it's really just about connecting the student with what they want and what they need.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Saege, since I know you can't see the chat, I'll share that Jackie Weinstock says, thank you, nice work. Building off of Kirsty's comments, and Kirsty also commented, Kirsty Nicole, that they're familiar with peer advocacy because they were involved in undergrad and also identify as a survivor, but didn't really start that healing process until last year. So thinking a lot about folks who also volunteer because of their own experiences, it's a lot to balance triggers, and they learned a lot about CPTSD. And I responded naming that for me, in my experiences, so many people who volunteer or work in the field of violence prevention and support are folks who have been directly impacted by sexual or domestic violence. So that's spot on. And this need for ongoing supports for advocates, regardless of whether or not they're peers or staff members. So Jackie followed that with curiosity on what you think would be most important to make sure peer advocates had in terms of support for them and supervision of them.
Yeah, thank you both so much. I think, I'm sorry, could you repeat the question one more time? I'm an internal processor, so sometimes it takes a sec.
So thinking about the supports that peer advocates would need. So what would be most important to make sure peer advocates had, like, what's the thing that they need the most in terms of support for them and in terms of supervision?
Yes, okay. Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up. I think that's super important, especially since CTPSD is such a real thing, and also just having this role as an undergraduate student can be really heavy and really taxing and very traumatic in its own right. And I think it's super important for the peer advocates to have a space when they can come into community and come together and talk and share and heal and cope with what they are holding, because it's a lot. And I think for the supervisory aspect of it, and the people that I knew that worked at Sharp, they had full-time staff that were always available for the peer advocates to kind of call up to if they needed extra support. And the peer advocates kind of had their own, at least I'm talking strictly at UNH. I have not been a part of another environment exactly like Sharp had. But they really sought community with one another, and that definitely helped. And I think having someone available and having a supervisor who is willing to, for them to call at any point in time to get them what they need. And they also were really part of the course was about self-care and how to take care of yourself in these situations and utilizing resources that you need, whether that be counseling and psychiatry services or maybe peer support groups, everything like that. It was very centered on how do you take care of yourself in these situations. And I think that's really important to name and acknowledge, and to have a supervisor know that that's a lot for students to hold, and being prepared to help students out and utilize resources for their advocates, and not only the people that are calling the hotline is absolutely essential. And it's like you can't pour from an empty cup, right? You have to take care of what your own needs are. And if that's stepping away from being a peer advocate, if that's doing what you need to do in order to show up and do the work, then that always comes first. And I think just transparency in that is absolutely super important to name. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Saege. One quick follow-up to that comment.
Yes.
Can you remind me, you might have said this,
Yes.
was the, to your knowledge, the Justice Studies course, was that like a fully, like 3-credit bearing course that counted towards people's completion of their degrees?
Yes. Yep.
Cool.
So it was a 2-credit course.
2 credits.
So UVM does credits differently than UNH does, but typically a full credit course at UVM is 3, I think, and it's 4 at UNH. So it was like a 2-credit course. So I think it met twice a week, I believe, or maybe once a week for a longer period of time. But it was a full course that counted towards your degree. Yeah.
Cool. So Sherwood has also followed up. You mentioned the need for representation of different identities in the peer advocates. And as we know, UNH and UVM are both predominantly white institutions. And he was curious, how did peer groups get numbers for the racial and ethnic identities and gender and sexual identities that might not have a lot of representation on campus broadly?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's hard to, in situations like this at predominantly white institutions, a lot of times students of color end up being tokenized into these roles if there's a need, or the department or the office is looking to kind of increase representation. And I think that's something that UNH ran into, and there weren't any types of like, oh, like we need, to my knowledge, that wasn't really measured, but I think it could, opening up peer advocate programs allows all students to kind of come in and seeing that representation. If there are students of color who are participating in those ways, then maybe it could, again, there's like no research, it's not really measured. So I think that's something that's definitely, that needs to be talked more about, and how, especially at PWIs, what that can look like. And is it more harmful? Is it helpful, especially for those marginalized student populations? And that's something that I definitely don't have an answer to, and I'm not sure what the best way to kind of navigate that is. But I think there's the potential for it to increase representation and possibly access, but it's not really something that is measured currently.
Yeah, and I know that you and I have talked about the fact that there's so little research, which is exactly there's so little research on peer advocacy or even on other prevention or support for sexual violence survivors on college campuses, which there has been more research since Me Too exploded, but isn't that just an example of, in fact, rape culture, right? We're not researching these areas because we're not seeing them as valuable spaces to put resources.
Exactly.
So, yeah. One other question that's come up, I will be conscious, we've got about 3 or 4 minutes left. Melissa Murray is asking, are peer advocates confidential resources? And if so, how does that work? Do you know?
Oh, yes, they are confidential resources. Both the community educators and peer advocates are confidential resources through SHARP. I'm not entirely sure, because I was a mandated reporter as a student at UNH, and I didn't experience what it was like to be a confidential resource. But that is something I can definitely look into and get back to you on. But I know they were confidential, but I'm not sure what that process of like holding that confidentiality as a student looked like.
Right. And so that's followed up by a question that, in your experience or knowledge, can a mandated reporter become a peer advocate? Are those two kinds of roles that someone can hold?
Yeah. Great question.
Yeah.
Definitely something that's tricky to navigate, but I think it's possible, because I did know students who ended up being both, just in different years, and what that looks like. And I think it can get a little bit messy.
Yeah, certainly in my experience, having worked at HopeWorks before coming to the University of Vermont, and so many of our hotline volunteers were college students, either here at UVM or at St. Michael's or Champlain predominantly.
Yeah.
And it is an interesting mix, right? So we had students playing this role of peer advocate for folks calling the hotline, for some folks, right? And what we know is that mandated reporter status that shows up, or the responsible employee at UVM, is based a lot of times on role more than it is anything else. And so I think about the ways that someone who is a mandated reporter as an RA on our campus, when they're acting in their capacity as a peer advocate, for example, might have that mandated status waived, but it gets very legal and very confusing. Yeah. And also want to name that what makes someone confidential, quote unquote, a confidential resource, that definition is tricky as well. Knowing that, for example, for someone to have crisis worker privilege in the state of Vermont, they have to have gone through 20 hours of training as a violence prevention and support advocate. And they go through these 20 hours in order to get certified. And what that then means is, once you've been certified, you are now someone that can support another person. And when they tell you all of their horrible bads, as I would call them, you are not subpoenaable. In other words, if there is a criminal case that comes up, your conversation cannot be subpoenaed unless that survivor releases permission. So there's that level of confidentiality. And then there's maybe another level that shows up for peer advocates. I'm not sure. Again, research would help.
Yeah. Now I'm curious, but I'm definitely going to look into what that looked like more so at UNH.
Yeah. So I want to be conscious of people's time. It is noon. And want to give an opportunity if anybody has any other burning questions and wants to unmute and or type something into the chat. We would welcome that opportunity. Also, Saege is sharing that if folks want to reach out, that you can find Saege at serobins@uvm.edu. You can always find someone connected to the Dismantling Rape Culture Conference at uvmdrcc@gmail.com. We will have other opportunities coming up over the next couple of weeks to include another undergraduate student presentation, a group conversation, a viewing and conversation around consent and restorative justice. And we are in preliminary talks that hopefully I can announce soon with one of our keynotes to present. So stay tuned to the Women's Center's social media spaces. For those who registered for the Dismantling Rape Culture Conference, you will get emails directly about those opportunities since we have your email contacts. And thanks so much for joining us on this Wednesday. Again, if you have any questions or comments, Saege and I will stay on for a little while and happy to answer those.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Hey, Saege, it's Valeria. How's it going?
Hi, Valeria. Good. How are you?
Good. I wanted to ask about, and I just have little knowledge about it, and I'm not sure if you do, because I know that you also have been at UVM for a little time, but I know about the group, I think it's called Four for All Men, or something like All for Men. It's like
One
a
in
logo
four.
of
1 in 4.
1 in 4, yeah. Because I'm not sure that we have peer advocate groups at UVM quite like UNH does. I mean, it seems like such a robust program. And as an RA, as you were also in UNH, I was also an RA here at UVM during my period as a student, and we were also obviously non-confidential resources that, as you said, would have to report if anyone of our residents or whatever a student would tell us a story that was necessary to report. Yeah, so I guess I just had a question if you knew of like the 1 in 4 men, and if that was kind of like a peer advocacy group, specifically maybe is it for men who, as you know, you said before, are also like underrepresented in conversations of sexual assault and sexual harassment?
Yeah. I've heard about it, the group. I don't know a lot about it. I've actually heard about it through Sarah. So I don't know if Sarah, if you want to jump in here, if you can give a little bit more perspective. I know that UVM doesn't have like a peer advocate program like UNH's, and that looks really, really differently. But I'm not super knowledgeable about 1 in 4. So Sarah, if you want to shed some light onto what their kind of mission, I guess, looks like, and how they show up on campus, that'd be wonderful.
Yeah, so 1 in 4, that name and the curriculum that they work off of is a national organization that was started, I want to say back in like 2002 or 3 or something like that. It started on our campus a little later, I want to say 2006 or 7. Keith Smith, who is the men's outreach coordinator out of CAPS, supervises that group. And it's kind of come and gone over the years. So there's been like a really large response and then a really small response. Right now they're small in number. And the work that they do, the curriculum that they used to follow, and they've shifted it a little bit, was specifically for folks who identify as men to talk to other folks who identify as men about sexual violence and their role in preventing it. Some of those tactics have been ways to try and engage young men in empathetic response, and have utilized some tools that I think have caused a little bit of harm for folks on our campus. And also because it's a group of men talking to other men, there has been pushback at times from folks who don't identify as men about what kinds of information are those young men getting from folks who don't identify as men, from cis women and from trans women and from gender nonconforming folks, about the impacts of sexual violence that are real to them, that can inform the guys' approach. Also, what's true is that 1 in 4 on our campus has presented to groups that are mixed gender. So should the tactics or curriculum shift if you're not talking to folks who share your gender identity, for example. So they've been grappling with those kind of really big questions of what's their role. It's shifted a lot as we've thought about sexual violence prevention since that group started. And I think it's super well intentioned, and there is a role to be played for folks who share gender identities coming together and having conversations about their role. And what we know about perpetrators of sexual violence that is reported is that the majority of perpetration happens at the hands of folks who identify as men. I say what we know of what is reported because it's important to recognize that not all sexual violence is sexual assault and physically manifested. So many behaviors are practiced by all gender folks that are in fact sexual violence, but might not be something that violates a policy or a law. So what is everybody's role based on all the kinds of identities they might hold and having those conversations? And I know that Keith Smith is doing, I think, really valiant work to try and open that conversation up. Right now, 1 in 4 is a smaller group, so I'm not sure what the plan is for fall. I don't think they'd call themselves advocates necessarily. And I also know that their funding does not come through SGA, so it comes from the Center for Health and Wellbeing. So that means that they're not, they can continue to meet as a small group, even if they don't meet the numbers requirement that SGA clubs need. That's what I know.
Thank you.
Cool, thank you. Appreciate that.
And to answer your question, Danielle, over here in the chat, yes, this was recorded and it's going to be up on the UVM Women's Center YouTube page. What? Check it out. Hopefully Lilac Vanguard, our F-word interviewer, will be creating a new video soon when she has time. Yeah. Any other questions? Any other thoughts as we close out? Awesome. For those who are hanging on.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm so happy you all were able to participate here with us today.
Yeah, and thank you, Saege, for putting all of this work and effort into what was going to be in person and for shifting it into this online model. I really appreciate your work and all of your research.
Thank you.
All right, stay tuned for more virtual programs of DRCC soon. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.